He issued a directive and guidance to county officials to exempt the UOCAVA applicants entirely from any verification requirements. That covered voters are exempt from ID requirements because no exemption exists in state or federal law. You can just like tag a state, you're like, I'm voting there, even though you've never lived there, like never had residency there. What? 5 U.S. House Republicans are now filing a lawsuit in Pennsylvania to get to the bottom of an interesting directive from the Secretary of State. We've seen this happen before where the rules are changed in the implementation of the election procedures. And that's how they rig it, to just cut to the chase. They don't change the statutes, they just implement things that benefit them. And we'll explain exactly what's going on. 5 Republicans are calling this out. So they filed a lawsuit. Here are the Republicans from Pennsylvania. Reschenthaler, Musser, Thompson, Smucker, and Kelly all filed a lawsuit. It's in federal court, and they're challenging different directives. When you are out of state, when you file a UOCAVA ballot, which is an overseas ballot or a military ballot, a uniformed overseas citizen, somebody who's not here, the voter must generally provide a social security number or an ID number, driver's license number, something, right? A number on the form so we can make sure you are who you say you are, the number. But in Pennsylvania, this so-called Republican Secretary of State issued a directive that states when these forms come in, it's like a manual. Okay, here's what the law says. Like the law doesn't explain what happens when a form comes in and doesn't. So the directive, the manual says, well, Pennsylvania and federal law are clear that voter registrations may not be rejected based solely on a non-match between the applicant's identifying numbers on their application and the comparison database numbers. So if the numbers don't match, you cannot reject it, which means the numbers don't matter. So the lawmakers' lawsuit says this is a problem, and they have sued. And so here's what that looked like. You can see this is filed in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, the U.S. House of Representatives, all together combining as plaintiffs to sue Al Schmidt, the Secretary of the Commonwealth. You can see it tells us that the congressmen are now suing, seeking re-election because they get re-elected every 2 years. So they're seeking re-election now, and they're saying this is going to be weird. This is going to actually impact our elections because we're running on the same ballot. So if you let in a bunch of votes that aren't legitimate because their numbers don't match, we can't verify they are who they say they are, that's going to impact our races. So they want declaratory and injunctive relief to ensure that the government, the state people, comply with the law about voter registration and verifying identity and eligibility when we count these out-of-state ballots. There's a law, the Federal Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, UOCAVA, that establishes voting privileges for the members of the military, their families, and other non-military citizens abroad. Now, this requires states to first determine the law if a voter registration applicant is qualified to have those privileges. Like, do you get those rights? Can you vote overseas and be counted? Federal law says, well, in order to make sure that they can do that, all states must accept and process, with respect to any election for federal office, any otherwise valid, if it's otherwise valid, voter registration and application before triggering the right for those voters. And so they got to check something. Now, to verify identity and eligibility, they establish minimum standards to do this. If they want to vote in a federal election and they want to use this right, they're overseas, they have to have, at the time of registration, a valid driver's license number. If they don't have a driver's license number, then it's the last 4 digits of their social security number. If they have neither of those, the states can give them a unique number to verify their identity and their eligibility. So somebody's got to check. Now, in addition to the minimum federal requirements, Pennsylvania law explicitly requires applicants, if you're going to use this out-of-state process, to satisfy the state requirements. And Pennsylvania law, so now we're not in federal law anymore, we're back down to Pennsylvania code. It says that an application may also be rejected if an omission prevents election officials from determining whether they're eligible. Now, in direct conflict with federal and state law, these defendants, Al Schmidt, this fella, you can call him Al, and what he is doing illegally, he issued a directive and guidance to county officials to exempt the UOCAVA applicants entirely from any verification requirements, which is very convenient for them. So that means nobody gets verified when they're voting from overseas, okay? Now, the non-verification position position has been confirmed in a sworn testimony in the General Assembly. So where did he say that? Like, you're not going to check them at all? What? When asked about how these applicants are verified in a 2022 hearing, Jonathan Marks, the guy who runs the election, Secretary of the Elections, he said in this hearing, he said, quote, well, that group of voters are specifically exempted from verification requirements. They said, well, how do you process the UOCAVA? He said, well, we're exempted from all of that. So they don't even have to provide any Pennsylvania ID, and they don't have to provide their social security numbers. And so there's no systematic verification at all. No systematic verification. Okay. They say that is all in an exhibit from the testimony, right? Public testimony during a hearing, House committee meetings, public hearing. And they are now saying that's what we do. Do you check? No, we don't. Okay. Why? Because they're exempt. So their non-verification position is also confirmed in their 2023 Pennsylvania Military and Overseas Voters Guidance. So then they write these documents, they ship them to everybody over there. They say, hey, this is the Department of State's position. And what they wrote in there is this, quote, the department's position is that covered voters are exempt from the election code's ID requirements from absentee voters. See that? No ID. That's referencing their own manual in Exhibit E. Now, the defendants cannot cite to any legal authority. They say it's our position that you're exempt. The election code, we just said you're exempt. Where does it say that? They cannot cite any legal authority, any statutory or otherwise, as a valid legal basis for their position. They just made it up that covered voters are exempt from ID requirements because no exemption exists in state or federal law. Oh, well, we're just going to exempt you. So you can just register as a UOCAVA person and whatever, get a ballot, and nobody cares. Nobody even verifies that you're a citizen or checks at all. And they say that's our position. They say, well, under the U.S. Constitution and the Supremacy Clause, preemption occurs when a state law or practice conflicts with federal law. And when it's impossible to comply with both the state law and the federal law, who wins? The feds. I know, it's terrible. But because the defendants' statewide directives conflict with federal law, which is the rule change that no, we're not going to check where they come from, and it's impossible to comply with both the directives and federal law, right? Federal law says check. The directives, the manual says don't check. The statewide directives are preempted by federal law. So those are now invalid. You have to not use those. Pennsylvania's practice, say these congressmen, is an illegally structured election process, which makes Pennsylvania's elections vulnerable to ineligible votes by individuals or entities who could purport to be UOCAVA eligible, register to vote without verification of identity or eligibility, but receive a ballot by email, and then vote a ballot without proving ID at any step in the process. See what that means? Vote by email and then vote a ballot. Get a ballot by email and then vote a ballot without ID at all. Now, the Commonwealth's position, their position that we don't even check, allows UOCAVA applicants to register to vote and to cast ballots in federal elections that do not comply with the requirements of both federal and state law. Their disregard for the law creates an opportunity for inclusion of eligible ballots such that the ultimate tally of votes may not accurately reflect the legal status, which could affect the close congressional election, which is an injury to all of these 3, 4, 5 Republicans and Trump and everybody else on the ballot and America, because Pennsylvania might be the exact state that matters most, critical to victory. Foreign nations or domestic secretaries like Jenna Griswold and Shenna Bellows and Jocelyn Benson, in efforts to interfere with U.S. elections, could easily submit falsified applications for votes to unduly influence these U.S. elections. Now, according to their absentee and their mail ballot report, over 25,000 UOCAVA ballots have already been transmitted to potentially unverified UOCAVA applicants. Do you see that? 25,000 of them already gone out. Now, the defendant's directives to county election officials to not attempt to verify or identify the eligibility of these applicants as required by federal law is an ongoing and continuing act, and it's an impending and continuing injury as the illegal election structure departs from the federal legal mandates. Total violation of both laws. They haven't cited anything to support their justification for it other than it's a directive. Therefore, we are congressional candidates. We're entitled to declaratory and injunctive relief in the upcoming elections, and so tell them to change that direction. Let's carry on in the lawsuit. Now, the parties are these congresspeople. We see them. They're running for re-election. Defendant Al Schmidt, you can call him Al, is the political appointee of Governor Shapiro, who's not a Republican. So here are the allegations. They say that the plaintiffs, who are congressional candidates in 2024, are forced to participate in this illegally structured federal election process, saying that Pennsylvania doing this makes the election elections vulnerable to ineligible voters whose identities could be submitted without verification. They could receive a ballot by email and vote without providing ID at all. Their practice allows them to register and to cast ballots that don't comply with both federal and state law. And potentially invalid ballots could be accepted, and in turn, the invalid votes could change the result of a close congressional election. The defendant's directives, the state's directives, to the election officials do not even attempt to verify the identity or the eligibility as is required under the law. And so it's a continuing injury. And so what we need here, what this is actually, is a misinterpretation of the law. This congressman is a plaintiff. He resides in this district. This guy lives in this district. This guy lives in this district. And the same with these other candidates. Now, here's the problem with it all. The Constitution's Elections Clause authorizes states to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections. Now, the Elections Clause, ratified in 1790 as part of the original Constitution, says the following: the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law, make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing the senators. And so they say, well, here's how we interpret that. First, the Elections Clause divides the legal responsibility for regulating federal elections. You can see primary responsibility lies with states, but Congress can enact to override them. Now, second, the plaintiffs also believes that the Elections Clause lodges the power to regulate the elections in the respective legislative branches of the states and the federal government. And so Congress, pursuant to the Elections Clause, enacted in the UOCAVA in 1986 regulating absentee ballots for overseas and military citizens is in effect. And that sets the rules. And the act applies to everybody. And it was signed into law by Reagan. The plaintiffs believe that this law facilitates military and overseas voters distinct from other absentee voting by providing privileges to eligible voters, right? You get some benefits. You get a ballot by email and other things. Now, we also understand that the federal postcard application is the form used by members of the military and their families to register to vote and to request an absentee ballot, including in Pennsylvania. These may be returned by mail, email, or fax. Under these laws, the form can also be used by U.S. citizens who reside outside of the United States, but who are not members of the military. Now, this form is both a voter registration form and an absentee ballot application, kind of combined in a single document, is what it says. And so this law is accurately quoted as follows, and it requires states to do this: to accept and process with respect to any election for federal office any otherwise valid voter registration. So somebody's got to be checking that. They understand that the privileges of this apply to an otherwise eligible individual, and it includes fields that they must provide a driver's license or a social security number. Now, the plaintiff is understanding is that federal law anticipates that the state will have additional requirements beyond that. And so there's also a form for additional information. Now, non-military UOCAVA eligible voters include study abroad students, might also qualify, individuals who work outside the U.S., or U.S. citizens who reside abroad, right? Many other people that we want to participate. Now, members of the military and their family members who vote as military under UOCAVA must have valid IDs that could be matched to data in government databases to verify identity and eligibility. So members of the military are known. The plaintiff understanding here, so the Congress people suing, is that unlike some states that allows overseas votes from those who have never lived in the state, Pennsylvania is not a never resided state, okay? You don't just get to claim you live there, meaning that only those U.S. citizens who lived in Pennsylvania before moving abroad would be eligible to vote in any election in Pennsylvania, which makes sense. You can just like tag a state and be like, I'm voting there, even though you've never lived there, like never had residency there. What? All right. Now, according to the EAC's report, Election Administration and this survey, in Pennsylvania's last presidential election, the state received approximately 2,700 ballots through UOCAVA, with 20,000 of those ballots coming from non-military applicants, right? So actually, most of them were not military. Only 7,000 were. Now, Congress, pursuant to this Elections Clause, enacted this rule, which included requirements that states verify registration information. In 2002, Congress also, pursuant to this, enacted HAVA, which is the Help America Vote Act, and that enables people to vote. The congressional record says that Kit Bond, a senator, talked about why we need this and talked about the ID process. He said, well, Congress has agreed that while mail-in cards have made registration more accessible, the mail-in policy has also created increased opportunities for fraud. To address this, we created an ID requirement for first-time voters who register by mail. That's why we passed this law. The security of the registration and the voting process is of paramount concern to Congress, they said. And the ID provision and the fraud provisions are necessary to guarantee guarantee the integrity of our elections. Every false registration and every fraudulent ballot cast harms the system by canceling the votes of legitimate voters, undermining all of our confidence. And so our understanding is that HAVA establishes the minimum requirements. You must have these things. If an individual has been issued a driver's license, they must provide the driver's license. If they do not have a driver's license, then it's the last four of their social. If they don't have a social, then that individual may not vote. The state may assign a unique number, but that individual may not vote in a federal election unless they provide some other document to establish identity and eligibility. Wow. So pretty strict, right? Data from the Social Security Administration shows that a very small percentage of U.S. adults do not have a social security number or a driver's license number. And so our understanding, they say, the Congress people, is that the small number of those individuals eligible to vote who have not been issued driver's license or state ID or social security numbers can still register to vote and be assigned a unique voter ID number by the state when they prove their identity by alternate means. And so these other examples are perfectly acceptable. Passports, military IDs, utility bills, bank statements, many things. Just name and address. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that they accept. And as detailed, they also provide for military and military families, and they get privileges to vote absentee. Now, before voting, eligible citizens intending to vote may register to vote and simultaneously request an absentee ballot using the federal postcard application. To determine if they're eligible, the states must first determine if they're otherwise valid. Pennsylvania law established ID and eligibility requirements, meeting the minimum standards. Congress passed this to speed things up, and there are additional requirements if you register by mail. Now, our understanding is that this is for first-time voters, and there are requirements under the law. The individual, if you come and vote in person, you got to present valid ID or show the name and the address of the voter. And if you don't comply, you get a provisional ballot. Now, this was also enacted in 1986 before email was even available. And so Congress enumerated an exception for those who registered by mail or who would be necessarily voting absentee. Eligible voters are not required to submit a photocopy of their ID when they return the ballot by mail. So there is an exception there. It shall not apply, so they don't have to send ID if they can vote absentee under the UOCAVA. Now, HAVA exempts UOCAVA from having to provide their ID, but it does not exempt from them ever providing ID prior to voting. And so Pennsylvania law says that they need to have ID. Pennsylvania law is quoted as the following, and our understanding is that this state law cannot supersede federal law. Minimum state requirements tell us what the status is. They're described here. 18 years of age, a citizen, a resident for at least 1 month, not confined to prison or convicted of a felony. And so we understand that the majority of these UOCAVA applicants, they provide a driver's license number or a social security number, but the defendant, the state, directs the counties not to even attempt to verify the information that they provide. Why? Al Schmidt is Pennsylvania's chief election official. HAVA also charges Schmidt, as well as his predecessors, with the responsibility of establishing a system so that we can actually check those that come in. The chief election official is responsible for this. These are what the rules say. Requires them to enter into agreements with all of the other agencies so that they can verify their IDs. Now, in violation of this, Pennsylvania's chief, Schmidt, or Marks, or both, they didn't do any of this. They were required under the statutes to do it. They didn't. They said as follows: those entitled to vote by absentee ballot under UOCAVA, they said this, are not required to provide proof of ID. That's interesting because they just cited right there and right here and right here all of the different rules and requirements pursuant to the statutes, right? So he's just not doing his job. We're just not going to check. They just don't do the work. Now, although defendants do have a process for required verification, defendants, the state secretary, instructs counties not to even attempt to verify them, even though it's required under the law. And in fact, in 2022, the secretary of the Commonwealth, the deputy secretary at the time, confirmed it as well. Said the current practice in Pennsylvania is to exempt the UOCAVA voters entirely from verification requirements. When asked, how do counties verify information for UOCAVA applicants during a hearing in the General Assembly, the Deputy Secretary for Elections, Jonathan Marks, he testified in a House committee public hearing. He said, well, that group of voters are specifically exempted from HAVA verification requirements. They do not have to provide any Pennsylvania ID or the last four of their social security number. There is no systematic verification, period. Not even looking. So the secretary and the deputy, both through the Department of State's guidance, includes the department's position that the UOCAVA applicants are exempt from ID, right? Look at this. It's right here in the manual. Here's their Pennsylvania military and overseas voter guidance. That's a good clip right there, screenshot. What are the voter voter ID requirements for covered voters. From Pennsylvania Department of State, the department's position is that covered voters are exempt from the election code's ID requirements from absentee voters. So every time somebody says, well, what's your evidence of voter fraud? Or what's your evidence of the rule changes or something? You know, it's not possible. It's right there. They're not even checking ID. So do you think that they're going to find voter fraud if they're not even checking ID? No, that's the point. It's in their own manual. Essentially, through directives and guidance to county election officials, they exempt the applicants entirely from verification of ID and eligibility, even though it's required under law. They have illegally adopted a position that the voter registration requirements for verification of ID and eligibility can be waived by just expanding HAVA's narrow exceptions to the additional mail ballot return ID requirements. If their directive and guidance are based on their position or interpretation of the statutes, those statutes, if they're trying to say it's based on this, those conflict with federal law. And despite the almost obvious contradiction between the federal law mandates, that say get ID, and their issued directives and guidance, 2 Pennsylvania administrative complaints have been rejected by the Office of the General Counsel, and they cite them there for further reading. Now, in the appeal, in this case, they've also filed a response reiterating their position, right? They're fighting this, saying, nope, they're exempt. But before the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice and the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, they've all confirmed, all the feds, these applicants are not exempt from voter registration. And the Federal Voting Assistance Program, which is charged with overseeing all of this, provides an electronic version of the FPCA. The website includes instructions to actually give personal ID. If federal law created an exemption from voter registration, then they wouldn't put those in the form. Now, the directive to county election officials is to not attempt to verify the info and to not attempt to match the information in the database, even if they provided a number. Do not match it. Do not look at it. The secretary or deputy secretary or both instructs counties to send a UOCAVA applicant a ballot without verifying their ID or their eligibility at all. In 2014, a brief that was filed by the DOJ on behalf of the elections assistants, they quoted the following from Arizona. They say, this comment by the DOJ on behalf of the EAC shows there is no federal exemption for UOCAVA, because they're citing an Arizona case. In fact, the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice and the EAC have confirmed that a state can reject FPCAs that are not accompanied with proof if the state law requires it. And there is no exemption to ID or eligibility for this. And the Supremacy Clause prohibits them for overriding direct federal law. Other states are able to comply with these rules, and other states do this. And our understanding, say these congressmen, is that Pennsylvania's procedures in this regard contradicts other states' procedures for complying with federal law. Other states can do it. But this is Pennsylvania. It's an important one for them to rig. So publicly available documents accessible on the internet include procedures, and in addition to the identification that's required, Ohio instructs them to complete their ballots, fill out ID, and they must provide their forms. In Ohio, they can do it. Georgia, wow, even Georgia's got it figured out. I'm sure Fannie had no role in it. Has a procedure properly to verify the identity of the voters. They've got it. They're training up there. Alaska does the same thing. What's up? Minnesota, they've got it too. Even Minnesota states on a PowerPoint, if the identification numbers do not match, board members must make an effort to satisfy themselves that the ballot was returned by the same individual to whom the ballot was sent. Here's some more. Accept, reject. Verification. The voter has provided the same ID number as on the application. Voters can provide their passport, driver's license ID number. If they do not match, you got to look into it. Did the voter is not known to have died? Some other things. Saying even they're referencing it. Says that if the county delegates a be voting to municipalities forwarded to them. Okay. In 2006, Federal District Court of Washington also issued injunction similarly. And so Pennsylvania and what they're doing here violates UOCAVA, does not meet the minimum standard. And the Supremacy Clause bars Pennsylvania from making exceptions to federal law. The only exemption is if you provide a photocopy of your ID. Otherwise, you're not exempted. And notably, Pennsylvania law does not allow citizens who have never resided in the state to register and vote in the state. So how would they even know? And so the understanding here is that eligible citizens who have previously resided in Pennsylvania and who could apply for UOCAVA would be required to provide license, photo ID, or other things. In fact, ID is required to board an airplane, to cross a border or to travel abroad, but pretty complicated for elections for our cheating politicians. Now, the plaintiff's understanding is that despite the fact that the most applicants who submit their forms do provide driver's license, the state has still instructed and continue to instruct the counties not to attempt to verify the info. So to be eligible, applicants must satisfy the voter eligibility requirement. UOCAVA requires states to first determine if they're eligible, but they instruct the counties not to verify the information. Nonetheless, the Department of State's guidance says that it is the department's position, even though the law says clearly otherwise, that they are exempt. And here, the DOJ just came out. They indicted Iranians. And so the Iranians, for example, could easily create and submit falsified forms in Pennsylvania's federal elections, right? The Iranians, that's a big one. Now, count one, UOCAVA, they say you're violating federal law, so stop doing that. A declaratory judgment and a statement from the court that the directives and the guidance that have come from the state are preempted by federal law. So stop telling them to just accept the numbers and all the ballots. Actually check. Issue an order granting injunctive relief, stopping Schmidt, Al, and others to facilitate those directives, right? So claw those back, but it's going to be the same people, the same employees who are executing the plan, and issue an order for an injunction instructing them to provide directions to follow the legally mandated procedures, follow the federal law, and actually verify the identity and the eligibility of the ballots. Issue an order for an injunction requiring county officials to segregate the ballots that do not have ID, put them in a separate bucket until we can verify the identity and the eligibility of the voters. Awesome filing from Karen DeSalvo, Eric G. Gardal, digging into this very sneaky change. And we've seen a lot of this. And I think a lot of this was unnoticed in 2020, but shout out to these Congress people for identifying it. And it's just marginal changes around the edges. We're just going to presume that the ID has been checked and you're exempted. We're going to waive the checking of the signatures like we saw in Michigan. And the fight goes on. So we'll be here continuing to cover this, my friends. Shout out to these Congress people for taking the fight in there in Pennsylvania. We'll see what the court says. Of course, the government's going to file their response saying, oh no, we check everything. Everything's great. And we'll see what the courts do. Pennsylvania is a big state, so we'll keep our eye on it.